Revolutions. Fascinating turning points in history when a series of events cause a massive change in the status quo. But between the American, French, Haitian, and Iranian, none were as radical as the Bolshevik October Revolution of 1917. A cascade of events in a backwater country led to one of the most dramatic, violent, and complex times that deeply impacted every human being in the 20th century. While there are thousands of spinning plates that led to all of this, at the root of it all, we have two people: Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and Vladimir Lenin. Both men were hardcore idealists, one tied to the old world, while the latter wanted to burn it all down, so a new one was made. Nicholas was often completely detached from reality, ignoring the state of the largest country on Earth, while Lenin was a master of manipulation who could sway millions of people with the spoken and written word. Ignorance and manipulation led to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and led to one of the most oppressive regimes with no free speech. Thankfully, today's sponsor, Ground News, provides a tool that combats both ignorance and misinformation. Their app and website is a place that gives you a panoramic view of how news is being covered around the world. In real time, Ground News will give a detailed reading of what political leaning each article has, what the typical leaning of the organization it came from is, and even who the financial investors of the organization itself are. Yeah, we know MSNBC is left-leaning and Fox News is right, but there's also countless other sources of news that are not so explicit. It's an app that pulls back the curtain on the information we consume, and gives you the broad tools to make the decision for yourself. What's even better is Ground News highlights local perspectives that might not even make it into bigger mainstream publications. That's why my favorite feature is their in-app map that takes you around the world faster than a plane ticket ever could. So go to ground.news/alternate to try it out. Subscribe using my QR code for 40% off unlimited access to the plan I use, making monthly access to unlimited insight that costs less than your daily coffee run. So what if Lenin never made it back to Russia in 1917? As I already mentioned, he is the second most important man for the October Revolution, so let's quickly summarize the reign of Nicholas II. Let's see here. He was turned paranoid and anti-reformist after witnessing his granddad, Alexander II the Liberator, get his legs blown off. He started his reign by hosting a grand ceremony for his coronation, at which 1,300 people died in a stampede. The first impression his people got of him was a young and cheerful Tsar dancing his worries away as the bodies were carried off the main square. He led a country a century behind the rest of the world as it struggled to industrialize and build the biggest railroad project in history. In 1904, a surprise attack from the Japanese led to a glimmer of hope. Nothing like winning a war in which nobody is willing to protect the attacker, but instead, it was a world-renowned humiliating defeat, in which Russia's Baltic and Pacific fleet, alongside its army, was crushed by the Japanese. The war led to strikes, famine, and unrest, culminating in a peaceful march on the Winter Palace by a friar and mob that sung Russian songs and prayed for the Tsar's good health, only to be gunned down by inept soldiers guarding the royal residence. The reaction to this bloody Sunday was the Revolution of 1905, which resulted in Nicholas granting religious freedom, gave autonomy to the universities, and most importantly, he turned Russia into a constitutional monarchy, forming the Duma, or parliament. But within 2 years, he reneged on his promises, made the Duma obsolete, and used the military to crack down on dissent, exiling thousands to Siberia. In the next decade, powerful ministers and rival factions competed for power, while socialist ideas were slowly creeping up amidst the peasants and workers of the country. Russia's rapid industrialization was only matched by its even more rapid radicalization. But like most monarchs, Nicholas was only concerned for secession, since out of his 5 children, only his last one was a boy, who sadly suffered from hemophilia, risking death at even the tiniest cuts or bruises. But overall, the Duma was starting to somewhat function. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was completed, the army was modernizing, and the Russian economy was about to become a powerhouse. Surely it would take more to topple the centuries-old Romanov dynasty. Oh, what's that? It's 1914? And Franz Ferdinand just got shot. After Hindenburg, the general, not the Zeppelin, crushed the Russian attempts to invade eastern Prussia, the weakness of the Russian army was apparent. So in a bid to save his country, Nicholas left the capital and assumed command, not as a general or strategist, but more as a cheerleader, boosting morale. While this led to some limited success, it also left the capital exposed, and the Duma decided that they were better off without him. The capital, now renamed Petrograd to sound less German, was seized, and Nicholas was captured on his way back. At gunpoint, the Tsar was forced to abdicate, and the monarchy was replaced by the Provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky. This was the so-called February Revolution of 1917, which hoped to completely transform the Russian state and society, granting civil liberties, freedom of speech, and freeing political prisoners. The only issue was that it was fractured into many different factions, each competing for power in the middle of the Great War, with Germany knocking on their door after already taking all of Poland and Lithuania. Speaking of Germany, they didn't just have the best military in the world at the time, they also had another trick up their sleeve. Vladimir Lenin, the exiled wild card, sitting in Switzerland, ready to cause chaos and spread Marxist ideas, holding the light that would make the powder keg of Russia explode. The German state loaded him and a few other revolutionaries on a train and sent him to Russia. It was on that train that he wrote the April Theses, the directives instructing the Soviet workers to take down the Provisional government and start a revolution. Keep in mind that these writings formed the backbone on which the Soviet state would later be built. The truth is that the communists were divided in many different parties, who lacked focus, and many were willing to make compromises. But Lenin wanted to go all the way, no matter the cost, and the final result of his speeches was the October Revolution of 1917. He became the unquestionable leader and gave his allies a mission, something his opponents never had beyond, "We hate the Bolsheviks." But what if that train derailed? What if Lenin never made it back to his homeland? The year is 1917, and the divided Provisional Government of Russia actually is made up of 2 governments, the second one being the Petrograd Soviet, led by Leon Trotsky. Alongside them, there were many monarchists, industrialists, nationalists, and even anarchists, each with their own goals and ideology. But the biggest question on everyone's mind was how this unstable nation would defend itself against the Germans. In public, the PGR stated that they were pursuing peace, but in reality, they planned an offensive in July which aimed to restore troop morale, which was waning, as the army now had no idea who or what they were fighting for. Break the stalemate, reconquer lost territory, and restore the confidence of Russia's allies, France and Britain. 900,000 soldiers were committed to this push, which ended up in disaster. Once again, morale plummeted. To make matters worse, General Kornilov of the most successful detachment of this campaign was now emboldened and decided to take matters into his own hands, launching a coup against the failing government. In a wild panic, Kerensky turned to the Soviets despite their own failed coup and armed their militia groups as a last resort. He chose what he saw as the lesser evil, but like the most recent Russian coup attempt, the plot dissipated within months. Up until this point, Lenin's presence does not alter these events at all, but this is the full departure and the beginning of a totally different timeline. You see, Jimmy, the Marxist ideas and various groups who appealed to the lower classes may have been present in Russia at the time, and now they were armed with not only opportunity, but guns, but the various groups like the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Social Democrats lacked the radical vision Lenin had, and never dared to reach for the stars. Even in our timeline, Lenin was considering elections after the overthrow, and didn't imagine that his revolution would take the course that it did. So what we see next is a steady but total divergence. Instead of overthrowing the government, the Soviets would overtake it. The Bolsheviks would join the Provisional government as its most energetic component. Their votes would force Kerensky to pursue peace with Germany, a bit more lenient than that of Brest-Litovsk. In its political fallout, the Bolsheviks would orchestrate Kerensky's resignation. Leon Trotsky would succeed him as Russia's chief executive. Rising nationalist movements would seize their opportunity and organize regional councils, breaking off from what was effectively a new government, with no ties with the imprisoned Tsar. Among them were Poland, Finland, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Some of these were led by Soviets who also wanted independent nations. Others wanted independence at any cost. The Russian government made their choice, and it was one that alienated Britain and France, who would now support all of these groups and all the supporters of the old regime. Not only because it meant bringing Russia back into the fold against Germany, but because they were horrified at the idea of communism spreading to their own lands, where some symptoms were already very prevalent. Starved for legitimacy, the Soviets would be forced to mirror our timeline in executing Nicholas and his entire family. Despite his many failures, the highly religious Russian society and its aristocracy believed in his God-given rights. While this act would discourage many, it would also light the fuse, leading to an all-out civil war. As in our timeline, the Allies would now deploy another military leader who was one of the few who reaped successes in World War I. Admiral Kolchak, who was touring the West in a form of political exile. It was there that he made many friends, before he was put in Vladivostok with a mission to take down the Soviet government. Despite being far more divided and unstable, the Soviets still held control of most of Russia's industry and population, while the remaining leaderless factions went to war against them. Kolchak was a celebrated war hero who scored major victories in both the Baltic and Black Sea. Now he was appointed as supreme commander of the Russian counterstate. Without Lenin, the Soviet-dominated territories, as well as those of their opponents, would be very similar, but both sides would be a nerfed version of the ones we know. A smaller Bolshevik threat means less support from the Soviets, less resistance from the Whites, and less support from the Allies. The only factions who would be stronger in this timeline would be those who wanted independence. Regardless, thanks to the supplies sent from Britain, France, America, and Japan, the White forces on the peripheries would enjoy a significant advantage. Two other important assets on their side were the Russian gold reserves and the support of the legendary Czechoslovak Legion, 500,000 strong. But all of this support and ambition also came with a cost. Kolchak was duty-bound to rejoin the war and aid the Allies against Germany and Austro-Hungary, which meant that the vast majority of the Russian lower class would do everything they could to undermine him. In 1918, the national movements would be left to their own devices, many of which would quickly fall under German influence. In the south, the monarchist General Drovdovsky led the armed forces of South Russia who supported Kolchak, and managed to crush over 75,000 Soviets with just 9,000 well-trained soldiers, capturing a huge swath of land between the Black and Caspian Seas. To the north, another army centered around the city of Archangelisk was led by another general, supported by 14,000 British troops, 5,000 American troops and smaller detachments from Italy, Serbia, Canada, and France. This force was a lot less successful, and did little more than keep Trotsky on his toes, wondering how he could defend against so many fronts. In reality, the main frontier was to the east, where the Trans-Siberian Railroad brought over 100,000 white soldiers, who clashed with the Reds, similar to our timeline. Progress was slow, and both sides resorted to a form of terror. While the Red Terror is well known, it was actually the White one that was arguably more unforgiving, as Kolchak believed all who stood in his path were traitors who abandoned their motherland in its most desperate hour. Despite offers of assistance by both the Ukrainians and Finns, Admiral Kolchak was unswayed, and saw all separatist movements as treacherous rebels. While the Red Terror was passed on by the state, and with a heavy focus on officers, the White Terror was indiscriminate. Everyone who assisted the Soviets or attempted to cut a slice of the Russian Tsardom for themselves was shot, hanged, or otherwise disposed of. Pogroms by the far-right sections of the army were widespread. Tens of thousands of Cossacks were executed. Workers and farmers were exiled to Siberia, even before Kolchak officially came into power. With the aid of the British Navy, General Yudenich was able to capture Petrograd, while the government was forced to move to Moscow. However, overextended supply lines, constant rebellions, rigid leadership, divided goals, and the inability to recruit new men slowed Kolchak's progress to a crawl. Soviets were able to make a stand at Kazan and hold the line, and the Ukrainians managed to beat back Drovstovsky thanks to German firepower, which they repaid with thousands of train wagons full of grain. Trotsky, meanwhile, was successfully arming tens of thousands of new soldiers who felt like they were up against the world, major powers who wanted to destroy their country and strip them of their newfound liberty. By this point, many questioned Kolchak's character, and with no monarchy to restore, the leaders began to question his motives. While the events in Russia were substantially different, the rest of the world changed very little, except the fact that there was now no great Bolshevik success story. This meant that by the end of 1919, the armistice between the great powers was signed. However, the war to end all wars utterly failed to deliver on its promise, as now Britain and France found themselves distracted by the Polish advances, rise of communism in Bavaria and Hungary, and the separatist movements in Ireland, India, and most of all, Turkey. While communism in Russia remained a threat, it was now lower on the priority list. So much of the aid that kept the White Army logistics alive was pulled back, and the Czechoslovak Legion returned home. The newly formed Polish state wanted to jump on the world stage with a bang, and they quickly mobilized for a war against Ukraine. The same occurred between the newly formed nations of Armenia and Georgia. Also Armenia and Azerbaijan. Also Georgia and Azerbaijan. Damn, Caucasus. Are you trying to be the new Balkans? Despite the massacre of millions, Kolchak won the war, and his victory allowed him to place himself at the head of an autocratic government ran by the same people who supported the Tsar. His ties with the West gave him legitimacy, but the economy was in shambles. Famine was widespread, and the fire of communism raged in the empty bellies of the Russian populace. Finland and the Baltics had international support, and powerful local regiments who resisted small-scale skirmishes launched by the White Russian government. While an army under General Yudenich was able to successfully reconquer Belarus, Kolchak knew he needed a win, and the support of his Western allies, and to acquire both, he turned to the good old tactic of attempting to win a war and face total chaos if you lose. Paradoxically, the Admiral spent the last 5 years fighting hundreds of miles away from the sea. But in the middle of 1920, an opportunity presented itself. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Greece and its allies waged a war deep into Anatolia. But the charismatic Kemal Ataturk led a movement against Turkey's invaders, and was successful in reclaiming most of its lands. This fragile nation was successful against its coalition of enemies. But in this alternate timeline, Russia makes a push for Ankara instead of Warsaw, which is well planned by the Admiral, who utilizes the Crimean ports and Black Sea Fleet to launch an invasion, which within a year succeeds in folding Ataturk's army and capturing his capital. Keep in mind that such a plan was considered by Kolchak in 1916, with the aim of retaking Istanbul, something which only the Fourth Crusade managed to pull off. Oh, speaking of which, Ultramar is now on an entirely separate channel. A visual novel building an alternate universe in the medieval world, centered around the idea, what if the Fourth Crusade went to Egypt? Anyway, in this alternate timeline, the humiliating Treaty of Severus is confirmed. Kolchak earns the undying support of the Russian clergy, military, gratitude of Orthodox Greece, as well as the support and investments from Britain, France, and Italy, all of which gain a slice of Anatolia. This external victory stabilizes Russia domestically. The fractured Soviet leadership is quickly given a show trial. Trotsky loses Moscow, and Kolchak turns into a dictator. A wave of anti-Semitism engulfs the country, and thousands of Jewish families are exiled. Or worse. The Great Depression hits the world hard, and instead of turning right, Germany is riddled with leftist movements. In our timeline, right-wing movements owed a lot of their existence due to the fear of rising Bolshevikism. But with a dictatorial Russia, that is highly unlikely. How would world events be shaped by this change? What would a Ukraine that never experienced Stalin's Holodomor look like? How are places like Turkey, or Greece, or Japan affected? Man, just look at how dramatically this timeline spins out of control only because of the absence of a single man, Vladimir Lenin, the uncompromising idealist which managed to give the Bolshevik movement the focus that it needed. Well, Jimmy, if you want to explore that scenario, be sure to keep your eyes open for the next sequel poll and vote for it. A huge thank you to all the patrons who continue to support this channel, as well as the Discord members, one of which proposed this very scenario in the first place.